Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Reichardt. I'm the editor-in-chief of New Eastern Europe magazine, which is based in Krakow, Poland, but we do a lot of work on the region of Eastern Europe, a lot of cooperation with the College of Europe here, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to moderate the opening panel discussion. Thank you very much, Madam Vice Rector, Professor Schumacher, for the invitation and for the organization of the event. And it's interesting is when I mentioned to some colleagues that I'm coming to Warsaw to discuss Eastern Partnership, some of colleagues respond, is that something that still exists? Clearly, of course, my response is yes, and there's been a lot of progress. We need to I think, be more vocal about that. But I think it's also a sign which shows the importance to have these kind of discussions, and I really appreciate the title of this conference, In Search of New Momentum, which really shows, yes, there's been a lot of achievements, but as was outlined already this morning with the opening remarks, there are a lot of challenges that still do face the countries in this region. And I think, I hope that some of these things we will get deeper into our discussions. I don't want to go too much into time on my own opening remarks. I prepared a couple remarks, but I want to, since we're a little bit behind time, I want to give the panel the discussion, the opportunity to discuss and give their perspectives. But what I really do want to just point out is that the transformative process that has taken place in the region, thanks to the Eastern Partnership, is, I think, something that if we go back 10 years ago to Prague, we wouldn't even have been able to fully conceptualize where we are today in the Eastern Partnership. Certainly, it hasn't been equal across the countries of the Eastern partners. We look at Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, who are really ahead of the game in terms of achieving the visa-free regime, the association agreements, and the deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. And then we have other countries like Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, which have gone on a more pragmatic approach towards the relations with the European Union and in the framework of the Eastern Partnership. But there is developments in almost every country that we can attribute to their participation in the Eastern Partnership framework. So. Please allow me to just briefly introduce our panelists. We have an excellent group. I think the title of our panel is really an excellent chosen title, so I would like to give kudos to the organizers as well, looking at the many shades of transformation, because really when we talk about Eastern Partnership, the phrase transformation is something that should be and is embedded in this concept of Eastern Partnership. But as I mentioned before, this transformation took place on very many different levels and not equal across all the Eastern partner countries. So hopefully, and I'm certain that we are going to go deeper into these discussions. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. On the far right is Mr. Vsevolod Samokhvalov. He has a PhD in International Studies from the University of Cambridge. He has written extensively on the Balkans and Ukraine, both as a journalist and policy analyst, and an expert in Eastern Partnership. To my immediate right is Ambassador Andrea Wiktorin, who is a German diplomat with extensive experience working in Eastern Europe and currently the head of the EU delegation to Belarus. On my far left is Mr. Andranik Shirinyan. Andranik, yes, a student from Yerevan State University. He just completed his Erasmus Plus exchange program at the University of Bologna, and he is involved in Young European Ambassadors Initiative and participated in the New Generation Summit yesterday, which was mentioned earlier this morning, which I also agree is an excellent way to tie in, looking at 10 years backwards, but also forward in the future, so welcome. Mr. Iulian Groza, he's a former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Integration from the Republic of Moldova and an expert in international relations and European affairs. Welcome. And Richard Giragosian, a founding director of the Regional Studies Center in Yerevan. So welcome all of you. The session that we have today, I would like it to try to be an open kind of discussion. Hopefully we can react to some of the comments that we mention in our opening remarks. I will allow each of you about 5 minutes or so for opening remarks, and I apologize in advance for cutting you off if you go too far. I will follow up briefly with some questions, and then I do want to open it up to the audience and allow for exchange of ideas, comments, and questions from you to the panelists as well. So why don't we start just to the right? Yep. I think you have a...
Yeah, it does work. Does it? Okay, good, great. Thank you very much, College, Professor Schumacher, Vice Rector, sorry, Vice Chancellor's Cambridge tradition. So for organizing, and I think 10 years is a great and important timing to take stock of what we have achieved. And I would like to start with a very brief conceptual note. When we speak about Eastern Partnership, we often tend to slide into parlor of institutionalism, talking about the budgeting, the setting in institutions, formats of negotiations. And these are very important things. But I would like to kick off with the idea that Eastern Partnership, by definition, went beyond itself in terms of creating momentum of commitment of the European Union to its neighborhood, Eastern neighborhood in particular, and set up sort of this commitment that when Ukraine was attacked only because it decided that it wanted to sign deep comprehensive free trade area, the European Union believed that it was too important and too serious business not to step in. And I think the couple of points that I'm going to put in the next few minutes will show that actually Eastern Partnership generated commitment which went beyond itself. And let me give you in the case of Ukraine to show when it was basically the success story of Eastern Partnership and its sort of added value. First of all, 5 positive points in case of Ukraine. The Eastern Partnership and the effort of the European Union helped Ukraine basically survive. We often take a baseline, this ideal model of the country. But if we imagine for a minute that in, 2013, Ukraine was on the verge of bankruptcy with imploded institutions and the army and special services penetrated by the Russian side. So the country was actually, as Andrew Wilson put it, ripe to fall into Russia's embrace. Over the past years, the institutions were rebuilt, army rebuilt, police reform conducted, with the support of the European Union Advisory Mission, there's going on reform of the Soviet monster Ukrainian Prosecution Office, which still runs on a number of old codes. So we can say that in terms of traditional Weberian state, Ukraine made a huge progress with the support of European Union not to fall, not to fail as a state and move on with certain reforms. Second, it's definitely the number of linkages is growing. The Director General has given some numbers. I can just add that the trade turnover has grown, went beyond of 20 billion. The important thing is that the growth of Ukrainian export to the European Union hit highest in decades, and the increase from the last year is 30%, and this is only official statistics. We're not talking about the gray sort of area of exchange of services. If you think about Ukrainian IT, which by various estimates hits about $1 billion of exchange with the broader West, we can say that there's growing and more intense connectivity in various fields. Roads, airports. Yesterday we witnessed another launch of low-cost flyer from Europe now, not to Kyiv, Borispol or Kyiv, Juliani, but to regional airports, which means that the country gets more and more connected with Europe. Third point, It's probably noticeable progress in the fight against corruption and crackdown of certain oligarchic groups. Some figures about energy efficiency have been given, but probably major important achievement ever since Ukrainian independence. National energy company Naftogaz has become first in 25 years a profitable enterprise. Before that, it was just black hole for money laundering and enrichment of specific groups. Soft matters. The resilience of the Ukrainian society has grown incredibly. We have crystallized Ukrainian political nation. Of course, there are still some tensions and there is still strong Russophile element or different regions. And at the same time, we had a specific sort of nation building program, which may be controversial, may seem controversial to some, but we can discuss it in the Q&A. Good news about conflict in the East, if I may put an optimistic note here, is that actually front line has been stabilized. Clearly, that's probably will be for the next decade, low intensity conflict, well, as long as Mr. Putin is in Kremlin and maybe beyond. But nevertheless, a positive note here, which I would like to highlight, the fact that Europe had, because of its Eastern Partnership policy, it had to face such a dramatic challenge made EU reinvent itself. We are talking now that EU has forgotten about its sort of sought institutionalist comprehensive security approach and now talking about integrated security approach. The words like early warning has entered into parlor in Brussels, and people really from the Commission, External Action Service and Concilium talk to each other either in the framework of EU support group or on different sites, trying to sort of come up with a proper response to any crisis coming from Ukraine. What has changed significantly, and I'm here referring somehow to my students past. When I was of your age, we were trying to figure out what partnership and cooperation agreement could do for Ukraine. And we were actually quite disappointed because reporting for Ukraine's progress was only once in 2 years. Now we can see that the number of reporting mechanisms for Ukraine in the EU-Ukraine relations made Ukraine always relevant and made reform always relevant in the Ukrainian agenda. When I'm flying Kyiv, Brussels, I always spot either deputy minister or vice premier traveling on almost weekly basis. That means that we have this sort of soft power of attraction and soft pressure. And finally, I think one important thing is that we have a strong, vibrant civil society, which is, you know, if we compare it to previous Ukrainian revolutions, today are sort of long runners. They are far more sophisticated, far less forgiving to the power, and far more sort of knowledgeable. And they understand that this is a long-term strategy. So I could speak about negative points, but I think I was so optimistic about Ukraine that I exhausted my time. So and there was some reference to sort of negative points, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Very important points, I think, that you brought up. I mean, Ukraine clearly is one of the examples when we think about the last 10 years of some significant changes, and negative ones as well, which maybe we'll get into more in the discussion. Now I would like to hand it over to Madam Ambassador for your input from your perspective from being as the head of the EU delegation in Belarus.
Thank you so much. Normally I'm used to be the last one because we have and then Belarus. I'm really, my deep conviction is that without the Eastern Partnership, we wouldn't see the small progress we have right now in Belarus. And you have to see, we are a special case. If you see the external factors, the EU-Belarus relations was headed by sanctions. And this meant that when the Eastern Partnership started, Belarus could only participate in the regional cooperation. There was not a real developed bilateral track. So we started rather late in 2015 with the release of the political prisoners. And there I really can see a change. In the beginning, they didn't know what it means, all these panels and meetings, and should we take part in it, and is it worthwhile? Now I really see a great engagement on the Belarusian side on the different topics. And this, I think, is an added value, and we should see it. Secondly, we have a special situation because we have a serious challenge, and this is the Russian-Belarusian relation. Russia, from the beginning, although I think the European Union and many member states tried to pass a message that the Eastern Partnership is not directed against others and that we are not asking our partner countries to make a choice. Nevertheless, Russia observed very carefully and with great mistrust. So everything was fine as long as the relation didn't improve. Unfortunately, the relation improved. And I remember that at a certain point my former Russian colleague said, a little bit frustrated in an interview, I don't know why these European officials are coming more and more to Minsk and disturb our relationship. I will not touch what the new ambassador says about the EU-Belarus relations and that we really have this strategic mind to separate Belarus from Russia. But this is an enormous factor because now it has impact in the economic field. They will face a very difficult period in the next years, and they know it. So they are looking for other partners, and with this perception in mind, there is a greater openness really to line up with the European Union. And they are forced to see that they need a transition and that they need changes. Not as fast as we wanted, but they start to work on green economy, small and medium-sized companies, and I think this is also very important to have a change of mind. Naturally, we sometimes, and this is still part of our relationship, have different perspective of what we want to do together. The Belarusian side is very much interested in a stronger cooperation in the field of economy and finance. That we always come back with values, human rights, death penalty, and rule of law is not totally in their interest. And when we discuss the vision, how we should continue the Eastern Partnership, it always comes, you need tangible results for the citizens, but they mean economic, we mean freedom, a vibrant civil society, an integration of the youth to develop ideas that we still have to discuss a little bit more. But they see the necessity to come to a good relation with the neighbors. We have one major problem right now. We want to go forward, we want to sign the partnership priority, which is the first ever paper we agree with Belarus due to the difficult relation. And there's a nuclear question of Ostrovets, and this is right now a stumbling block, and we try to overcome this. But I'm confident, and what I always tell all my partners in Minsk, you can have the European Union only as a package, which means we offer cooperation, we need your ownership, but you will never get the European Union without values.
Thank you very much. Very good points as well, and I think, I mean, we've been watching Belarus very closely this last several months as the situation appears to be somehow evolving, and I think a very interesting point how you mentioned that they're looking for partners in Europe, and the Eastern Partnership as it exists, this could be an opportunity. Maybe Belarusians might not be so enthusiastic about it, but could kind of hook them in there a little bit more to be more active in the Eastern Partnership. Now I'd like to move over to Armenia with Richard's presentation. Another, until recently, thought of a special case of the Eastern Partnership, but some very significant changes taking place in Armenia as well. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. And I must confess, I'm rather excited. I'm excited not only to be at the College of Europe, I'm excited because this is not just a conference, it's a birthday party. It's a celebration. And like every other typical 10-year-old, the Eastern Partnership is still developing, learning, and amazingly, rapidly adjusting. What we also see is a second reason for me to be excited, because of the opportunity to offer the Armenian perspective. Because what Armenia represents is a rare success of non-violent people power in a context of a Eurasian Game of Thrones. We see an example where Armenia has surprised and exceeded expectations, counterintuitively in some context, where the success of Armenia's so-called Velvet Revolution has ushered in an unexpected degree of promise and opportunity in a largely youth-driven, massive outpouring of frustration that was channeled into positive change. But if we look closer at the Armenian model, what's important is not only what happened, but what didn't happen. In terms of a surprising reaction from Russia, uncharacteristically passive and permissive. What we also see is Armenia's victory was a reaffirmation of European values and ideals. But what happened in Armenia was also not a geopolitical struggle. There were no flags. There were no cookies given out at the Maidan in Armenia. This was a domestic-driven agenda. The geopolitical context, naturally, will reemerge at some point, and we have to be prepared. But this was a priority on domestic change after over a decade of rather complacent yet arrogant elite formation. What we also see is why Armenia matters, why the strategic significance for the EU, because we do stand as a very impressive model of opportunity. Opportunity that, despite our overdependence on Russia in the past, despite the misperception of Armenia being little more than a Russian garrison state, finally we're able to overcome threat misperception and find a way to actually challenge the Putin model of authoritarian leadership, and in many ways forcing others to look to Armenia for new inspiration. In this context, the Armenian citizen is much more an actor and much less a spectator in the future of his or her country. And who's the agent of change? It's the youth, but it's also the premise and promise of Armenia today. But at the core of change in Armenia were three components: education, engagement, but also empowerment. Because what the Eastern Partnership represents is not a solution to all of our problems, but a very important tool or utility for us to assume the burden of responsibility. Because coming to power in Armenia was the easy part, let's be honest. The real challenge for the current government of Armenia is a challenge of governance, concession, and compromise. And if there's one priority recommendation for the EU and the Eastern Partnership, it's to help us address our biggest weakness, which is not a threat from the old guard elite, nor a threat from our neighbors. The most pressing priority is our inexperience. What we need most is the expertise from the European Union and from the Eastern Partnership. In other words, give us the tools and we'll build a better Armenia. And in conclusion, it's important to say in the Armenian context, there is no conclusion. This is very much a dynamic, not static process. We are still creating the country we want to live in. And as someone who chose to live in Armenia and not to leave Armenia, it is with pride to note our accomplishment. And this is a stepping stone and a foundation to both conflict resolution as well as the imperative for regional reintegration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for those remarks. Particularly, I think it was very interesting what's taking place in Armenia, and I'm sure Andranik will have some more to talk about as well as from the youth perspective. But I think in terms of Eastern Partnership, it will be very interesting to see how that goes forward, and we'll get into some more then the discussion. Moving now to Iulian about his perspective, also coming from Moldova, which a couple years ago, from our perspective, particularly in New Eastern Europe, our journal had a special issue in 2014 about Moldova being the star pupil of the Eastern Partnership, and a lot of that has seemed to kind of fade away with the more recent developments. So I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on and your take on Eastern Partnership in Moldova.
Thank you very much, and just let me tell you how happy and honored I am that I'm part of this panel, but also attending this conference here in Natolin. My last time I was here back in 2013, my previous life capacity, and I'm really happy that I'm here today as a think tanker, dealing more or less with the same issues, looking over Eastern Partnership and what works and what doesn't in terms of ensuring the transformation in our region. Launched back 10 years ago, the Eastern Partnership aimed to secure transformation, prosperity in our region. Looking back, Moldova, I think, brings a great example of both successes and failures of Eastern Partnership. And in my short introductory remarks, I will refer to a few points which worked, few points which didn't, and I'll try to outline few ideas to contribute to the reflections about the future of Eastern Partnership. Assessing Moldova's participation in the Eastern Partnership, the progress was made more in areas where it did not involve sustainable implementation of reforms, respect of democratic principles, rule of law, which requires stronger political will from the governing elites. EaP worked much better when it implied short-term financial, economic, or political gains for the elites to enlarge their internal support as well. The EU conditionality and benchmarking policy was much more effective every time it had an important reward, be it assistance, visa-free travel, or access to your market for our products. Now, let me briefly outline 3 points that I think worked in terms of the Eastern Partnership. First, for Moldova, the association agreement really brought more approximation, more linkages to the European Union. It provided us with a task to approximate our legislation to almost 70% of EU acquis. Now, back in 2018, over 40% of the acquis under the cessation agreement has been transposed in Moldovan legislation, which is quite an important figure. However, the challenge lies in the implementation and practical, real application of the legislation. Sometimes, what it is important is a few articles in the directives and regulations, and sometimes, or very often, it happens that this legislation is partially transposed, and really that is the issue that we have to look into. Visa-free travel, I think, by far was the best result of Eastern Partnership. It brought both tangible results for citizens. Now in Moldova we have over 1.5 million citizens who travel to the European Union, which is half of the population. I think that is an important gain for citizens in the first place. However, it also brought some tools which helped for a while to push the reform agenda. The benchmarking policy, which was linked to these results, but also it helped to push the elites in the right direction. Also, with the visa-free travel, what we had, coupled with the accession to the free, to the common airspace of the European Union, what we have observed was an increased travel of our citizens to the European Union, cheaper prices for flight tickets. That is a real direct impact. Plus, you had a stronger mobility among youth, among businesses. That is a very important gain. Finally, DCFTA. Definitely DCFTA brought Moldova economically much closer to the European Union, made the European Union the stronger, the biggest trade partner of Moldova. Now the exports amount to 70%, while the imports from the EU are about 50%. Still, when looking to the east, we export to Russia about 10%. That also is a figure just showing you that Moldova, after 4 years, brought much more closer to the European Union. And when you look at the net impact of the DCFTA, few figures I'd like to outline. There is over 360 million euros, which was the net impact of DCFTA, which was calculated some of our colleagues from expert group in another think tank in Moldova. It also contributed to over 15,000 jobs. It rose the budget revenues by 5%, and also increased the capital investment in private sector to over 300 million euros. But also what I think is important in terms of DCFTA is that DCFTA application in Transnistrian region made the region to be the first and only breakaway region which is implementing EU-type agreements. Yes, we're not happy with the speed, but still there is a process of harmonization which involves that. It also contributes to building confidence. There are many things to be addressed, but that is a fact. The DCFTA is applied in Transnistrian region, and that is also when looking to the figures, you have over almost 40% of exports from the region going to the European Union market, over 40% trade with the rest of Moldova. And when looking to the imports, the majority of imports coming from Russia, while the exports to Russia is about 10%. So you see also Russia business interests see potential in DCFTA, even though criticizing and banning Moldovan trade after Moldova signed and implemented the association agreement back in 2014. Briefly, what didn't work? I already referred in my first remarks, but despite positive developments, transposing Eastern Partnership political normative framework into the national agenda, improving sector cooperation with the EU, benefiting from EU financial support, getting closer economically to the European Union, still the value-based part of the association agreement didn't work. The political and democratic transformation in the country did not occur yet. The reforms have been largely tackling secondary elements, though important, but without fundamental changes, having a marginal impact on internal transformation. One key internal factor, and I would not like to address now the external factors, so just to focus on the main internal factor. One of the key internal factors was that negatively impacted Moldova's performance on the path of transformation, we believe are the veto powers of the vested interests that limits the political will, accepts high-level corruption, do not reform judiciary, and perpetuate poorly functioning institutions. Looking ahead, if the veto powers of vested interests are not properly addressed and challenged, one of the main goals of the Eastern Partnership to secure stable and prosperous democratic Moldova will never be attained. To overcome such a resistance, the EU has changed its approach to Moldova. It became more critical, more outspoken, applying more stricter conditionality. That proves to work for a while, but still the challenge is that it also lessens the leverage. Now, briefly about some ideas what could be discussed for the future of Eastern Partnership. First, I mean, we all, especially those three countries, Eastern Partnership countries, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, always were struggling to get European perspective. The news is probably, the bad news is probably we will not get it in the nearest future. However, this should not discourage the pro-reform elites in our countries to push for transformation, work on European integration, and try to apply tools which would help us to attain intermediary objectives, using, for example, the concept of differentiated integration, trying to use the enhanced cooperation, looking for example, a more closer cooperation with the new European Public Prosecutor Office in addressing high-level corruption, or looking into more instruments which would help also citizens, again, like in the case of visa-free travel, single accession to the single European payment area, or when looking to the security, of course, more should be done in terms of our cooperation in countering hybrid threats and cooperation in PESCO. Finally, what we can do in order to somehow push the transformation and try to map better the backlogs. Our idea is to look into the enlargement toolbox to see what worked there and try to address it and try to adapt it to Eastern Partnership countries, in particular to those who are engaged into more enhanced agreements, association agreements, or SEPA in case of Armenia. We would be very happy as a think tank community, together with other colleagues from the civil society organizations in the region, to increase our role in monitoring, but also in identifying those backlogs. Why not to do the screening, trying to do the proper screening of the legislation, institutional screening in our countries, because association agreement, for example, you would see in it that it provides clear normative, basically, objectives, much better in the sectoral cooperation, DCFTA, less concrete benchmarks in terms of judiciary reform, of the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So that would help us to go further. And my last point is really on EU support, EU conditionality. From our point of view, the EU support should not only be strict, but also it should be more targeted, more smart, really trying to address the key elements of the system to deconstruct or to destroy the house of cards, which is in service of the vested interests. And I'm here talking about, if to talk about judiciary, then one should look into the elements which are really elements of change to address that point. So I would like to stop here, and I will be more than happy to more elaborate on that in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, we definitely will get, I think, more into some of the situations developing in Moldova as well. So I want to hand it over now to, last but not least, to Andranik, who's going to give us his perspective as a young person coming from an Eastern Partnership country. Also, maybe talk a little bit about the summit yesterday and what was discussed and thought about.
Thanks a lot, dear professors, excellencies, honorable guests, participants, and Nathalie students. As Mr. Giragosian mentioned the birthday party, I started reflecting on me when I was 10 years old, and I remembered me being, as our countries may be, a little bit ambiguous, but also ambitious and full of potential. So after the Soviet collapse, our countries were ruled by the authoritarian regimes, as we were calling them. But somehow the unrest in Moldova in the first decade of the 21st century, and also the revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, managed to discharge these authoritarian regimes. And also we are getting positive hopes from Azerbaijan, as the freeing of political prisoners happened last week, and also it brings hopes also for Belarus as well. What happened in Armenia? Well, after the bloody events in 2008, and also after Armenia joining the customs union, we somehow lost hope in democratic values. And we didn't see happening the revolution in our country. There is a poem which says that hold fast to dreams, as for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. So we didn't believe that we will be able to fly again, as we somehow changed our path and we moved forwards to Russia. Now, if you will ask me how the revolution in Armenia happened, I will not have a precise answer from the youth perspective, but I can only say that young people like me believed that it can happen. Elder people like my parents believed that it can happen, and also my grandparents believed that it can happen. And somehow people went to the streets and believed that the revolution in the country can happen. And somehow, in the times of the destruction, and also from the ruins of democracy, we started creating a new country in which we believe. We also called the revolution that it happened through Facebook. This I mentioned to mention importance of the IT sector and the new technologies. Somehow everyone was filming and doing live streamings in the country what is happening. During the time of revolution, I wasn't in Armenia. I was studying in the University of Bologna, as I'm a beneficiary of all those programs that EU is doing in our countries. And we found each other in Facebook, all the students that have been studying abroad from Armenia, and we were collaborating with each other. We were going in front of the embassies of Armenia, of the foreign countries, protesting. We were writing messages to high officials in Brussels, in other countries, and also to some media to go to Armenia and to cover what's happening there, because we beared in our minds what has happened in 2008 in Armenia. Well, as a participant of the New Generation Summit, we have some recommendations for the high officials who are sitting here to bring some changes in our countries, and I will read those recommendations now. We highly encourage the EU to develop regulatory frameworks which tackle cybersecurity threats on the elections in our countries. The EU should also assist its Eastern Partnership countries on the fight against disinformation. The EU should support human rights educational programs and cultural projects that are locally owned and enhance domestic leadership and legitimacy. The EU should set up long-term strategies to empower women by promoting gender equality legislation and awareness-raising campaigns of the existing legal protection. And to add from my side, I would like the EU also to make some pressure on our countries to pass the anti-discrimination laws in our countries. The EU should insist on the full implementation of judiciary and anti-corruption reforms, and also the EU should provide additional funding to civil society and establish a platform within the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum solely focused on anti-corruption. And in sometimes, even if our countries are not doing good, our people are the main treasure that we have in our countries. And 70% of Armenians and Georgians believe and trust in the EU. Almost 60% of Moldovians and Ukrainians trust the EU. Almost 45% of Belarusians and Azerbaijanis trust the EU. You have done a lot of work to gain this trust, but we have a lot of more work to do not to lose this trust for our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now, as chair and moderator, I'm going to quickly ask each of you all a short, brief question, and then we'll open it up to discussion with the audience. And actually, I would like to stay with you, Andranik, about Armenia and what you had just mentioned, and kind of come back to Richard's comment that it was a youth-driven event, the revolution, but it also wasn't a geopolitical, it was more domestic. However, I would like to ask, just as someone who's from the youth and from that generation, how much, at least in the back of the mind of the youth, was this idea of European Union integration and Eastern Partnership in the participants who were going out on the streets in the revolution?
Well, the problem with my generation is that we somehow live in a bubble and we don't see what's happening outside of our bubble. That's the case also for me because, well, in some time of my life, I believe that all of the people in Armenia, living in Armenia, are pro-European and they are craving for the European values. But then I went out of my bubble, just going out of Yerevan and seeing what's happening in the regions and seeing that people don't even know what is it to belong from the European family, what are those European values, because what information we get, all those people from the regions, they get is some disinformation or propaganda and misinformation what European values stand for. But young people yet like me, as we are getting more ties with the EU and getting more information, though we don't have still the visa-free regime, unfortunately, but as the ties get closer and people travel across Europe going and coming to Armenia, and there's the Erasmus Plus program, a lot of people are seeing what the European values really are. And the revolution was for democracy, though it wasn't mentioned that it was pro-European, pro-Russian, or against Europe, against Russia. No, it was for democracy and for the democratic values. And when the young people were asked in the streets, are you fighting for European values or for Russian values, they were saying that we are fighting for Armenia, we are not fighting for any values. We just want our country to prosper and we don't want to see ruining democracy in our countries.
Great, thanks. Yes, please, Richard.
To add very briefly, because I endorse your views, what's interesting is from an American perspective, we have a concept too big to fail. Usually applies to Wall Street. But in the Armenian context, what's interesting is Armenia is simply too small to fail. And what I refer to is the fact that Armenia is so small in population and territory, it's not a negative. In our context of democratization, being this small means it doesn't take much and it doesn't take many for real change. And the change is already underway. There's little chance or risk of going back to the status quo of before. We are forging ahead. What's necessary now, however, is to no longer simply support individual Democrats, but rather to support democratic institutions. This is what's needed to sustain the gains and success of Armenia, especially in terms of resiliency. Because, like it or not, Armenia stands as an irritating example to Putin, to the Russian model. Armenia is now a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, Collective Security Treaty Organization, yet with the SEPA, with the EU, as well as a more democratic and a free and fair election, this Armenian government has a commodity that's in scarce and rare supply: legitimacy. Legitimacy translates into political will. What this means for the European Union and for the Armenians is having a more democratic government means we should expect and demand more and no longer excuse bad behavior. We need to be honest with our friends in government, and that candid, honest approach means we expect and demand greater accountability, especially from a more democratic government.
Great, excellent. I want to stay on that track, but move over to Ukraine briefly, because this weekend is a critical moment, talking about elections and democracy, and also maybe too big to fail, because Ukraine is quite large and often considered too big to fail from the European perspective. Real briefly, in a minute, what should we expect, if you can even predict, on Sunday?
Right. So, again, so I guess one of the most unexpected things that happened in Ukraine in the past 6 months was the fact that actually the populist paradigm had taken over. So you've probably all known that polls show that the front runner of the presidential campaign is a stand-up comedian, right? So he's a smart person. 25 years ago, I happened to start with him, and I was doing stand-up comedy as a student. So some of my colleagues told me, you should have not changed profession. But I think I did right choice, and I'm not sure that Ukraine will make right choice electing Vladimir Zelensky as a president. But let me just boil it down to the fact that actually there's certain frustration, as Professor Schumacher mentioned, the fact that the EU and the Ukrainian political class hasn't managed to address social costs of reforms, and the fact that current Ukrainian regime or government, however pro-European it is, and how many reform it would conduct, is still immersed in certain corruption networks and old practices, created this feeling of disappointment and disenchantment in the existing sort of paradigm. And the vote for Zelensky, who is basically, often called, yes, he is clown, but I will vote him just to piss off all the rest, seems to be, quite a disappointing development for a country which had overthrown a dictator. Now, even if he does not win, because we might have a second round, we will probably have, and even if one of the sort of more traditional political actors prevails, he will definitely be present in the Ukrainian political scene with the forthcoming parliamentary elections, and we will have sort of rise of populism, but I would say different from European, a bit of aesthetic lefty populism, and this will be, in my opinion, this will be a hurdle to the reform, especially given the fact that there is strong evidence that Mr. Zelensky has a particular relationship with one of the oligarchs in Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you. And speaking of elections, Moldova also just had elections, and the results are, I mean, from my perspective, fairly mixed. We've seen the Socialists and the Democratic Party do well and seem to almost cooperate in some sense, but also there was an emergence of a real opposition that did, for the first time, get some seats in the parliament. Could you just take a minute and kind of explain what, from your perspective, the political situation will look like going forward in Moldova, and how it may affect the cooperation in the framework of Eastern Partnership?
Thank you. Briefly, I think uncertainty and instability, that would be an assessment for the next years. But looking back at the elections, a few points about that. For the first time in years, these elections were less about geopolitics, so it was not about the EU and Russia. And that is a plus, because now Moldova society is very much divided over geopolitical vectors, and these elections actually helped to bring in front real issues in terms of basically those who are pro-reform and those who are not interested in that, or those actually who are comprising the group of vested interests behind the government, not willing to transform the country. The second element, which I think is important, is that indeed we have, in spite not very free and fair elections, although they were recognized internationally as such, but the context of these elections was very much impacted by the change of electoral system, which was done almost 2 years ago. It favored, we were then saying that it will favor the bigger parties, incumbent parties, and it did. It did favor the Democrats. It secured for them 35 seats in the parliament. It also partially favored socialists, although I think they are the biggest losers of these elections. I think it was not very smart from them to support the change of electoral system, because that brought also a very contested politician, which is actually indicted for banking fraud, for the famous banking fraud in Moldova. He was indicted, but his case is still in hearings in the appeal process. But he became member of parliament, and actually that is a new element, which is not very good for our image of Moldova, but still. Another point I think which is very important, indeed the emerge of more fresh blood in the parliament, of new politicians, new opposition. They got now pro-reform opposition. They got now 26 seats in the parliament. 26 seats in the parliament. Just to give you a figure, in the previous parliament, socialists had 25 seats in the parliament. So, I think, even though most likely the pro-reform opposition will not be part of any government formations, although they already declared that they are ready to take responsibility for a minority government, but that most probably will not happen, because the incumbent government is really actually aiming to perpetuate the current structure in a way to reach out to the socialists. So in a way or another way, we might have a government which is still with Democrats in charge. Ahead of us, we have other elections. We have local elections. I think they are even more important, because that would further or strengthen the vertical of power from the central to the local level. I'm not saying it's not happening now, but it will even further be used to secure the incumbent party's interests, and it will be quite challenging in that sense, especially as the new government most likely will undertake the reform, the local public administration reform, the decentralization. So we should very carefully observe the process so that it will not favor the interests of the incumbents. So,
interesting.
Briefly, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And last question for you, Madam Ambassador. It won't be about elections in Belarus, but I do want to briefly ask, because this topic came up from the youth discussion about the EU has to do more in terms of disinformation. And I do not envy your position as being head of the EU delegation in Minsk. How do you communicate to Belarusians what Europe is?
Yeah. I could not agree more that really strategic communication is one of the really important things. I think we had a lesson to learn. We love to quote figures, we come with structures, and then we lose the people, because they want to have stories, they want to have an impact for their well-being. So we have to adjust our messages to our public we want to reach. We have serious problems in Belarus, because the TV is Russian. They have a Belarusian one, but it is rather boring. So everybody looks Russian TV, and they get all the disinformation. So they get this image, the EU is some organization supporting gay marriage, they do strange things, and we always find that the Russian side took over the values, yeah? They say, we are the defenders of the values. Look at the chaos in the European Union. And there we have to put a positive message. We do it with small actions. Something what we introduced, for example, now was the girl shadowing. also Shadow Day for girls, to have a modern way of celebrating the 8th of March, working on gender equality and also open possibilities for women. We want to go on a real big campaign on youth, because we are convinced that young people are the future, we have to reach them. But I must confess, it is also a struggle with the state-owned media, but I can go to several events, and if you read the reporting afterwards, you have some Belarusian officials, and you do not know why this strange lady is standing there around. So this is something which remains our challenge.
Thank you. Okay, so we have maybe 10 minutes or so. I would like to open it up to comments and questions. If you have comments, please keep them brief. If you have questions, please address them either to a specific panelist or if you have it generally. And also introduce who you are. I have one here, and the second one will be here, and third one in the back.
Yeah, well, good morning. Still, it's morning. I'm the ambassador of Armenia to Poland, Samuel McCutcheon. Thank you, the Natolin College, for organizing this event to take stock of the 10 years of Eastern Partnership, and thanks a lot also to our panelists who outlined their national perspectives, though it's kind of from the academic or research point of view. Let me add quickly a couple of points from the official stand view. The Eastern Partnership, as any other framework of cooperation, is not immune to deficiencies or problems. It's quite natural. And it's really the right approach is to focus on the achievements and also to build on the achievements and to move forward. Armenia's involvement in the Eastern Partnership has been rather, at some point, even controversial, because we embraced the framework during the former authorities back in 2009. And then it could be surprising that even when the former authorities were engaged, at the first stage, the level of ambition of Armenian engagement was even higher, because we successfully negotiated an association agreement. But unfortunately, we overlooked, certain geopolitical constraints. And that brought to that unfortunate incident when we backtracked, that's very briefly, but though extremely briefly, because immediately after our backtracking on that association agreement, we again in earnest were involved in renegotiating our the format of our relationship. And fortunately, we were successful to convince the European side, which was at the very beginning, after that unfortunate point, was suspicious of the real intentions. But we were successful to convince the European side that we are serious in our engagement. And it brought to the renegotiation of a new agreement of a lesser ambition, but still very ambitious and very important for Armenia. Now we signed it, now we are entering the implementation phase. And this is the new momentum for Armenia, the successful implementation of this SEPA comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement. But then the former authorities were swept away during the last year, huge, massive civil movement in Armenia. And where is this could be puzzling at the first moment, but the answer is that the society, Armenian society in general, in both cases, has been very supportive of the European orientation and European agenda, because, as I have been saying recently very often, Armenian engagement with the European Union is not only a pragmatic one, it's also a value-based one. Because we have a variety of different foreign relationships, but with the United States and with the European Union, it's a value-based. With the others, it's really pragmatic. So that was the core of the, that is the core of our relationship with the European Union, because the society in general is supportive of the European values and will be supportive in the implementation of these new arrangements.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, thank you to all the speakers. I'm Elena Korostilova, University of Kent. I have a lot of questions, but for the sake of time, I will limit them to two. One is to Richard, please. I'm going to play a bit of a devil's advocate here. I've been taken by a phrase when you said, give us the tools so we can create our future, almost quoting you here. But isn't it something that the EU has been doing for the past 10 years, giving Eastern Neighbourhood the tools so you can actually engage in your own future? What do you see should happen different? Because this is exactly, I think, what you had in mind speaks to my understanding of resilience. I would like you to elaborate on that, please. And of course, Andrea, I cannot miss you on your presentation. You're one of those unique diplomats who really, having spent so much time in the country, you have really the first-hand knowledge of what is going on and how it is going on. So what should be the practical steps that we, as the EU, can take now really to push Belarus in terms of tilting a bit more towards the west rather than the east? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll collect a few more questions and then we'll wrap it up together. Yes, Krzysztof Babinski in the back. Is there a microphone?
Thank you very much. Krzysztof Babinski came from the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum. I want to pick up on something that Richard Grigorian said about the weakness of the Armenian revolution, which is, or change in Armenia, which is experience. Wherever I go into conferences and meetings, etc., in Yerevan or in Tbilisi, and if a young person stands up and talks sense, has self-confidence and has information and knowledge, they're usually graduates of the College of Europe in Natolia, sometimes from Bruges. This is really an appeal to the authorities in Natolia. Change is going to come in the Eastern Partnership region. It might not come tomorrow, it might not come the day after, but it certainly will come not only in Armenia but in other places that we don't know. And the challenge, as Richard said, is having experienced people to manage that change after the change. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure that the College of Europe is doing great work in its curriculum on the Eastern Neighbourhood policy, but maybe the appeal is to think more about educating people to manage the change afterwards, because they are very much needed, will be needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I see four more, and we'll have to cut off because we really are running out of time. So yes, here in the middle, and we'll just go in that direction.
Hello, this question is addressed to Mr. Reichardt. This is in regard a little bit into the continuation what Mrs. mentioned before about giving the tools, and then Armenian civil society will have the political will to push through. In the light of the signed SEPA, which has been provisionally applied in 2018, I would like to ask that, or actually even emphasize, that the political consequence cannot be underestimated in this regard. And if I were to say that even if Armenia is not pushed or legally obliged to approximate with the EU economic related laws, it might have to do so to comply with the objectives of SEPA, because as you know, it is designed to somehow create a positive sectoral spillover across different sectors of Armenian domestic laws. And in that case, approximating and adopting and implementing this SEPA initiative might be very costly and to some extent very time and resourceful consuming. And in that regard, if the civil society or even the officials within this government notices that this is a very time-consuming project, to what extent can we somehow have a forecast on this political will last very long? Of course, it is not only very difficult, technicality is very difficult. The SEPA agreement is 359 pages long. And in that regard, this is the question that I would like to ask you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There were two more comments or questions right there. Next. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Yael. Thank you very much for your interventions. I am a student of the College of Europe here in Natolin. I'm also the head of the student society, EaP Student Society, which organized the New Generation Summit yesterday. And I have a question to you, Ambassador Wiktorin. I was wondering, so you explained that the EU's increasing involvement in Belarus is seen from the Russian side as a sort of encroachment onto their sphere of influence. And I feel like often there is this creation of the other in both sides. So the EU also sees Russia as encroaching on the neighborhood. And I was wondering if the increasing representation of Belarus, of the EU in Belarus, it can also serve the purpose of engaging in further dialogue with Russia, or is it always the occasion for Russia and the EU to be divided and create more tension between the two, well, Russia and EU?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And towards the middle, yes. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for wonderful speeches. My name is Denis Genja. I'm Young European Ambassador from Ukraine. And my question is also to Mrs. Wiktorin. You're very popular today. And Your Excellency, really, yesterday at the New Generation Summit with my colleagues from Belarus, we were discussing the issues which we already raised, that who should be the engine of changes in Belarus, because really she blamed that or accused Europe of not be very integrated into Belarus or not very active in Belarus. But I asked her if people want to be the leaders for change, the agents of change. So my question is, who must be these leaders of change or engines of change? Thank you very much.
Okay, and last one, up here in front. Yeah.
Hi, Lawrence Meredith, Director for Neighbourhood East in the European Commission. No, just in your view, we talked about trust in the EU. What would interest me is to hear what from your different experiences is the one thing that you think is most productive in building trust in the EU among citizens across the Eastern Partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's do closing remarks. Everybody, I'm sorry, we're very short on time, as always. But we'll just start this way. Some of you have questions to answer. Others, if you have just, if you want to start.
Yeah, since there were no specific questions to me, I just react to the last one by Lawrence. So I guess one of the things that made a sort of dramatic effect on Ukraine in this regard was, of course, visa liberalization. So we saw immediate peak in applications for the passports and the increase in travel. And of course, currently, there's the number of internet memes, traveling across Ukrainian segment of internet of elderly ladies traveling from somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Ukraine to the migrant children in Marseille, Brussels, or London. So I guess if we speak about sort of non-institutional but deeply societal effect, this is probably something that the EU should look at. And again, referring to what Mr. Danielson said in the morning, I fully support the EU effort with civil society, but I think we should go beyond usual definition of NGOcracy, right? Civil society, it is community leaders. Civil society, it is a church. Civil society, it is farmers who maybe don't speak English and don't know. Civil society, it's just a simple person living in, next to front line in Mariupol, but still sending his everyday food supply to some checkpoints, etc. So it's civil society should be our conceptualization and driver for change should be seen in broader and more comprehensive terms.
Okay. What could be the next practical steps? I think we have to continue what we are doing. I'm not talking now all our economic and energy and whatsoever program. I'm really talking about enabling civil society and young people. Is mobility, exchange programs, do more. In Belarus, we have the wonderful MOST program, which offers young professionals the opportunity to build networks in EU member states. This is very important. We have to convince the Belarusian government, who think they have a totally, and you're right, totally different understanding of civil society. Civil society, these are these strange people influenced by the West to produce a second Maidan in Minsk. And it is one of my most demanding tasks within the last 3 years to convince them that we have a totally different understanding of this and that we want to have people a say. And this brings me, who should be the leader of change? Again, we have to convince the government. It is a country where the president changes the policy with one quote in the media. And this we have to see as a reality. So therefore, you have to go double track. You have to be in contact with the government. I want to have free and fair elections, which most probably will be end of the year. So we are also heading in this direction. If you ask me honestly, I'm not over enthusiastic that we will have free and fair elections, because the president is already now going around and says how great that he has 80% of support in Mogilev, and that he will also look after the other 20% who do not want to vote for him. But this, we have to ask for introduction of changes in the electoral code according to the OSCE ODA standards. I think this is very important. So we have to talk to the government, but it is naturally the civil society and the youth, and we have to enable them to present their ideas and their visions so that they are heard. And this is one of the main tasks we have here in Minsk. On Russia, we tried it. I think we tried it on every possible level. Politically, both the EIS and the Commission, we tried to give the message on the ground. Unfortunately, I would not say that Russia is convinced that we really mean what we are saying.
Thank you. Richard.
Let me combine both questions. First, to the anonymous questioner. Mr. Richard will try to answer. What's interesting, oh, there you are. What's interesting is I'm not worried. I don't share the concern. Armenia was able to negotiate and even initial our association agreement before a sacrificial lamb paradox. Therefore, there's little doubt or questioning of the political will. In terms of the cost and the time constraint, if you will, that's actually a burden in Elena's question. In other words, the challenge now is in the tools. And the challenge is it will be burdensome, expensive, and costly, not for Armenia, but for the EU. Because what happened was, yes, we were provided the tools, but the old government threw away the toolbox. Many of the recipients, most of the recipients of EU finance training, expertise, advice, went to former government officials who are marginalized. Therefore, we have a new government. We have a new parliamentary system of government for the first time. Therefore, I hate to say it, but we're going to have to reinvent the wheel. And it's a burden and challenge. Hopefully, Brussels will be up to it. But it's less a doubt of political will or receptivity or resilience, and more giving the tools to the right people this time. And my final thing to note is the real threat for Armenia in terms of stability and the efficacy of the current government. Yes, inexperience. But what's really a concern is dangerously high expectations among the Armenian population for the government to deliver results quickly and efficiently. This is why if we look at one issue to regain trust, what we need is a communication strategy to explain coherently what are the benefits of engaging with the European Union for the practical citizen and the practical consumer. We did a poor job explaining that before. And by articulating or defining European values, we can defend European values and explain what European values are not in the face of Russian disinformation.
Thank you. 1 minute each. And we're done.
Lawrence, I think we all know what is good to be done in order to increase trust into EU. I think the example of Moldova showed that. I think the more outspoken EU is towards the governing elites whenever issues come up, irrespective of their geopolitical orientation or pro-European or whatever, I think EU has to talk about it and to be very clear about the issues. I think that example showed, this showed Moldova then back in 2015 when we had this banking fraud, the credibility of the EU was somehow wear out 38%, also because the governing elites were somehow not probably addressed by the EU at that time. Then, 4 years later, EU's credibility has increased to almost 50%. Why? Because EU became more outspoken, more targeting citizens also at the same time. And I think over the last 1.5 years, also the communication strategy and visibility campaign of the EU in the country, like Moldova, has also improved. And I think this should be continued. I think it's very much connected to the support that the EU is providing. This support should be further decentralized to aim improving accountability of the governing elites on the local level, to assist development of capacities of small and medium-sized businesses, local actors, and at the same time to bring public services closer to citizens. And when people will associate the benefits they get real on the local level with the European Union, believe me, the credibility of the EU and the trust in the EU will further increase. And I think what is even more important when talking about support is to help, to capacitate all these actors who are agents of change for the long run, to have the capacity to observe whatever support will be dispatched to them, because that is also an important issue on the long run. Thank you.
Thank you. Last word.
I will elaborate a little bit on the trust part. As I mentioned it, Armenia has 70% of Armenians trust in the EU, and we don't even have the visa-free regime. I can't even imagine how much we will trust the EU if we get it. Another point I want to mention about the trust is maybe from our part is, in the case of Russia, before we have always been thinking, or there was that approach to Russia as a big brother, and there was this superiority among our countries about Russia and about Armenia. But in the case of the EU, we see that the relations and the communications between the EU and Armenia are as equals. We don't see EU as the superior, we see it as an equal to us, and that's how EU approaches Armenia as well. And that's the most important thing that built the trust for Armenians to the EU, that you are approaching us as equals, and we are seeing you as an equal to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this morning's discussion. Thank you. It was very lively.